So I'm with Jeremy Thomas today. I think we met a few years ago. We both work at ISU, and we were on a panel together
That's right.
for a gender and sexuality conference. And I can't remember the exact topic, but I know we were talking about pornography addiction.
I think we were looking at some different perspectives, kind of a spectrum of people who were into kind of addiction perspectives and some who weren't, and kind of had some dialogue and discussion about some of the different angles. That's right. That was
That
a
was a
good.
lot
It
of
was a good
fun.
event. Yeah.
It was fun. So Jeremy, he is the director of gender and sexuality studies and an associate professor of sociology in the Department of Sociology, social work, and criminology at Idaho State. And he earned his Ph.D. at Purdue. And even more important than that, Jeremy's just a cool dude. So I'm excited to spend some time. Every time I chat with you, I learn something new because your training background is very different than mine. So you approach these topics differently, and I always appreciate that different perspective.
Sure. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So why don't you start us by telling a bit about kind of your research background and how you even got started studying sexuality, religion, politics. Like those are the things you're not supposed to talk about. And yet those are the things that you study.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, part of my background context is I grew up in a very conservative, religious, evangelical background in Kentucky, and I was actually a minister in a evangelical denomination for several years, and I have a Master of Divinity degree, and ended up moving out of that. But it was experiences in that context that led me to pursue additional graduate work and kind of got me started at Purdue University, where I did a master's degree and then my Ph.D. in sociology. And my interest, so coming out of religious training, religious background, but I was really interested in sexuality. Really, uh, really at the core of that, kind of a big motivation was that I had seen lots of people growing up and working in religious church kinds of contexts who were struggling with sexuality and religion. So certainly think about pornography, think about homosexuality, about a range of kind of understandings, activities, relationships that do with sexuality that were often very difficult for people to navigate. And so as you might expect, people are coming with or interacted, encountered, and knew lots of people with shame and with difficulty, frustration, trying to navigate around many of those topics. So when I went to Purdue, I knew I was interested in really thinking about this interplay between religion and sexuality. And one of my major kind of focuses there was to think about how religions, religious people, religious organizations think about things like sexual morality, how they frame and understand different sexual issues, and how they how kind of a broad level of thinking we might think of as like a theology or maybe kind of a philosophical orientation, how those interact with people on the ground. I was also in my kind of graduate studies there at Purdue really interested in the political context of that. So we know that religious groups, we know that science and research, all of these kinds of things are in conversation with one another at a societal level. So religion isn't independent from politics, isn't independent from society, but they all influence each other, and they all, in one sense, kind of interpret each other and kind of draw on each other's resources. So it kind of did that, and I explored a variety of topics at Purdue. Homosexuality is one of them, but then especially I focused quite a bit on pornography and religion. Then it came to Idaho State University and kind of continued various related lines of research, but certainly religion and pornography, and ended up doing a lot of research in the context of thinking about the addiction model to pornography and what research has to say about that, but also spent really a lot of time thinking about kind of we might think of as modern history of religious approaches to pornography. So I was looking at predominantly conservative religious groups, so certainly evangelicals, LDS, also conservative Catholic groups kind of here in the United States, and the different ways that they had responded to pornography, sexuality more generally, but especially pornography, roughly in the last 70 years, kind of since the end of World War II. And so one of the things, kind of the story of pornography is obviously it's a technological story in part. So in the following World War II, we really begin to see kind of the mass distribution of print pornography. Now, which of course, pornographic erotic materials available in societies, a good 100 years plus earlier than that. But really following World War II, began to see the wide kind of distribution of pornography in American society, and kind of the stereotypical Playboy and these kinds of magazines. In the 1960s, really begin to see distribution of video media, both in kind of adult bookstores and in adult theaters, but then also becoming increasingly available at home. So by the 1980s, we have VHS tapes, and we have increased distribution for private viewing of pornography. And then, of course, the internet, the World Wide Web by the mid-90s really changed America's and, of course, the whole world's exposure and accessibility to pornography. And so one of the things that I've traced in my research is to think about how religion has changed, religious groups have changed in their kind of interpretations and responses to pornography over the last 70 years, just as at the same time science and research has had a lot of developments, as well as politics. So I've kind of traced, in one sense, we can think about those three histories and kind of the interplay. And I think that historical perspective is really helpful to get a big picture of what's going on. So that's just a little snapshot of my kind of religious, but research kind of background, how that's played into kind of what I've been doing.
Wow, I can't wait to dive in, because as you talk about that, you're right. Like when I'm working with people, you really just can't talk about sexuality by itself or religion by itself or politics. They are all interacting, and you said that they are also, I don't know how you said it, they're interpreting each other. Can you say more?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So like with religion and thinking about the relationship between religion and morality. So religious groups very typically have moral expectations, codes of behavior, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things we find, this kind of been a function of the last, say, 70 years, the United States and around the world, has been what I tend to think of as kind of a shift in the grounds for moral authority. So if we think in the United States and we go back to the 1950s, there was really a sense in which religious scriptures, as well as religious tradition more generally, were kind of a foundational moral authority for the country broadly. So certainly the Bible and kind of religious teachings and leadership around that really formed a base kind of moral assumption for the whole country. So one of the things we've seen in the last 70 years has been, what sociologists often call secularization. It's kind of had a widespread ramifications, so that there's less public reliance on scriptures and religious teachings, religious authority that there used to be. At the same time, we've really seen a rise in kind of a broad popular sense for reliance increasingly on science and technology as trying to kind of steer human behavior and guide society. Now, there's then an interesting interplay between the two, so that at times science has obviously critiqued religion in many kinds of ways, and religion has critiqued science, but it's a mistake to really think of them as being fundamentally at war. That's a kind of a narrative we often hear, kind of faith versus science or that kind of language. But really, they interpret one another in the sense that religion has fundamentally changed as science has developed, as research has gone on, and as the grounds of moral authority has changed, religious groups have increasingly relied on science, medicine, health kinds of frames and narratives to guide human and moral behavior. So instead of arguments for like pornography saying things like, don't view pornography because it's sinful, the Bible says so, or the religious group says so. Increasingly, we find arguments that say pornography is bad because it is bad for you in some type of scientifically demonstrable way. And definitely that's played out in terms of the addiction narrative, is that we should avoid these things because they're harming us in kind of a medical health sense. So this represents kind of a broad shift. So religion has taken kind of this broad scientific perspective and has essentially increasingly utilized it, both really, I think there's kind of two pieces here, both to help explain human behavior and also to help guide or control or shape it. So one of the questions that many religious groups have faced with regard to pornography, say in the last 70 years, is a question that goes along, why are more and more religious people viewing pornography? And
That's a
so,
huge question.
yeah,
We
so I
think
mean,
like,
there's no doubt. I think it's very, very clear that more people view pornography than they did, well, 100 years ago or 50 years ago. You might think why that is. Well, on the one end, the one angle you can say, well, accessibility. The
yeah,
internet, porn is there. It's on your phone. It's on everywhere, all the time, anytime you want it. That's, of course, way different than it used to be when you had to go to the seedy side of town, to go to the adult bookstore in order to procure pornography. You don't have to do that. It's readily available. But I think for a lot of religious groups that were coming at religion, or were coming at pornography from kind of this focus of sin or moral failure, these kinds of lenses, is kind of raised the question of how do we explain the fact that, say, a whole collective group or maybe a generation of people are now sinning more? Or how do we explain the increase in sexual moral failure? And I think a lot of religious groups struggle with that because it didn't really make sense to say, if we kind of think of it on a collective level, it didn't really make sense to say, well, human beings all of a sudden got more sinful. Now, I mean, there's some kind of religious traditions that might kind of go in that direction to some extent, but it really wasn't all that adequate in explanation. So one thing about kind of looking at these health frames, and particularly the addiction narrative, is it provides an understanding that kind of externalizes responsibility for pornography viewing. And it says it's not that people are choosing to view pornography, it's that there's something fundamentally outside of my control. So I think that that's one of the kind of allures there of the addiction model, is that it kind of offloads responsibility for both at an individual level, but also at a collective level. And then I think something that's equally important, if not more, is that kind of narratives of health and harm along, the addiction narrative, but also more broadly, become ways of trying to guide society more generally. So if you think about a religious group, like in America, we've tended to have religious, kind of one way to think about it is you have your religious group and then you tend to have everybody else in society. That's how lots of religious groups think about it. There's us and there's them. Some religious groups are a little bit more kind of going together, and some have very stark differentiation between the us and them, but it tends to be kind of an underlying piece there. And one of the questions for a lot of groups is, how do we get the them to behave better? I mean, there's the us behaving better too, but the them behaving better. And so as things like scripture, Bible, religious teachings, etc., went along over the last 70 years, there's good reason to believe they became less effective at guiding other people's behavior outside the religious group. So there was a sense in which, I really think following World War II in the 50s, on up into the 60s, in which there was a kind of cohesive moral narrative that was essentially what we sometimes call Judeo-Christian or biblical, kind of in a broad sense. There was some agreement on kind of the tradition and the Bible, especially being these kind of historical moral guidance.
Yeah.
With secularization, that has significantly dissipated, and instead people are guiding their lives, or society more general, into this science kind of based narrative. Well, framing pornography as a health crisis, and specifically as addictive, but as well as kind of other kinds of or corollary harm framings, become a way to try to urge people outside the religion to behave in kind of more traditional ways. So when I say that religion and science are kind of interpreting or working with each other, religion is being changed by kind of science and technology and health and medicine, but it's also interpreting that in a particular kind of way. And so we can kind of, one way to think about that is to think about that interplay in a political sense. So if we think about politics in kind of this broader sense of framing the narrative, religion is kind of, religious groups have participated kind of politically in trying to draw on scientific narrative or science, et cetera, research to promote certain kinds of action, and then certainly kind of legal and legislative things, criminal actions. So trying to really influence society on the basis of a particular interpretation and use of science. So I think that's kind of the story there on one level.
And I think that's incredible. And as I listen to you talk about that, I don't know how many people are aware of that context and that interplay, because often we think about our own behaviors or sexuality as something is very much, it's my responsibility. Like if I'm struggling, it's all on me. And yet there's so many external factors and such a history that I think without understanding those roots, we may not be able to influence or direct our behavior as much as we would like.
Yeah, I think like the sociologist in me, and by sociological training, one of the things that I think we really take away there is that human behavior is not just doesn't just reside or is explained at the individual level, but that what we do, what humans do, what different groups and cultures do, is largely and significantly a social production. So just as, I mean, if you kind of take a step back, I think it makes sense. So if you're kind of coming from a religious group and you grow up in a religious group and it guides your life, it's not surprising that you're guided in particular ways. And it has an influence on you, and you think in certain kinds of ways, and you do certain things and don't do other kinds of things. You're not just a random individual, you're part of a group, and your behavior is shaped by those around you, by family, peers, by your religious parishioners, congregants. These things have a huge effect on your life. And so when we think about something like pornography, one of the kind of, I think, pitfalls to fall into is to just think that somehow you're violating, or if an individual from a conservative religious group might just interpret that as like violating their kind of religious context. But I think they fail to remember that they're also part of a much bigger society, and that much bigger society is having a real influence. Things like the internet are not, I mean, they influence you. This is real. It makes a real world difference that you're in a society, and that's kind of part of it. So it's not just individual decision making; it's the world around us, and that makes a difference in what we do.
It's huge. And I read an article that you published a few years ago in the Journal of Sexual Compulsivity about this very topic, and you referenced it here. But when you said like shifting the narrative to more of an addiction, to kind of offload that moral responsibility. Sure. I can see how that transition where it's like we still need to guide people morally, and yet maybe some of the religious messages we've used are losing some of its potency. So we're going to adopt some of this scientific psychology language. And what I have seen is when I'm working with somebody individually, they kind of unknowingly adopt that same narrative and feel like, yeah, something is happening to me externally, and now I don't have responsibility for my actions, or I'm powerless to. And so that effort to like, we need to help people manage their behavior, sometimes backfires and makes it less manageable because they're not aware of how that narrative came to be and how there was a shift over time. And now it's like, no, everyone believes this is an addiction, and now I'm stuck. And so it wasn't an effort to kind of shift that responsibility, but for the individual, sometimes that doesn't work very well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think there's all kinds of difficulties with that. I mean, I always think, well, kind of one of the fundamental pieces that if religious persons are struggling with pornography use, I think a much better narrative is to recognize and own the struggle that on the one hand, you may be part of a religious group where you're committed to certain norms, values, behaviors, etc. But on the other hand, you're part of a society that essentially has different norms, values, and behaviors. And there's a real tension there. And so, at least like sociologically speaking, we find that people often want to do conflicting things. I think sometimes we simplify that and really try to like, I don't want to like come across too negative there, but we have kind of this religious framing of denying the world and denying these kinds of things. And the reality is people aren't all that great at it. With kind of enough structure and enough kind of normatizing systems, they can kind of recreate that culture. And so you have like religious groups have very typically, especially conservative religious groups, have very typically tried to monitor exposure to the outside world, or try to cloister people, or try to prevent them, like at least with some religious groups, using the language of becoming too worldly, of getting out there and being influenced.
Yep.
And I mean, I think that really makes logical sense, because the people you hang out with do have a huge effect. So if you participate in American society broadly, it's not surprisingly that you're going to experience sexuality with the same degree of tension, or that's really underlying between different perspectives in the like, say, American society, especially over sexuality.
That's wonderful. And I think about another intersection that I've seen is coming from that more conservative religious background. There is that effort to protect people from the worldliness. So often there's less sexual education. And what I've seen is kind of a direct correlation between lack of sexual education and struggling with sexual behaviors later on, like pornography. Because there's just kind of a deficit in language, awareness, comfort, people you can talk to. So, but it's coming from like, we don't want to expose people to things, and yet that somehow can make it more likely they're going to struggle with sexuality.
I think if we were to go back a couple generations, it was arguably easier to keep people kind of siloed in particular religious spheres of their lives, kind of keeping those lives separately. And I think technology has arguably had a really huge effect on sexuality, but on life generally. And so if we think, like, sociologically speaking, I think about what we call like modernity in this broad sense, which is in the last 100 years, in the last 200 years, our ability to interact with other people and other ideas has just grown exponentially.
Oh, yeah.
The accessibility of ideas, of knowledge, of pornography, all of these kinds of things are so much more present. So it becomes very hard in the modern world to try to protect people from ideas. And I would argue that it's just simply much less effective a strategy for religious groups. Probably a much better strategy is to really engage collective thinking about norms and values that people want to live by, and having it's kind of like you have to somehow trust your parishioners much more to be individually responsible and to know why. Why is always a big question for religions. Why do we have these rules about whatever? And I think in kind of the broad world today, we've also had, with modernity, very much this kind of the rise of the individual. And when I hear what I'm saying in modernity, I'm saying like the last 500 years. So if we think about kind of the rise of modernity, and the scientific method is part of that, but it's kind of this idea that people have to understand things for themselves. They're going to have to make decisions. And so sometimes we have religious groups that are really trying to operate from a position of kind of unquestionable authority. And that's, I think, arguably less effective than it was. I think there's kind of a problem with the addiction narrative. Is it's kind of, I've known lots of religious people who've participated, and then you kind of see people like fall out of the religion. So it's kind of like you can kind of have this, it's almost like you're creating this edifice with all these things that have to hold together. And, like with sexuality, maybe porn addiction becomes one of them. And then sometimes you'll see people go along and they'll start to question whatever, and it all starts to crumble and fall apart because it's not built on kind of an internal sense of values, but it's trying to hold together somebody else's system. So I think that's a challenge for religious groups broadly, but it might be helpful from the perspective of a religious group to really think about inculcating more generalized values that could then play out in different kinds of ways, for instance, with regard to sexuality.
Yeah. And I've seen that play out where I'm working with someone who's been struggling with pornography for a while and have kind of followed some of the addiction principles that often faith groups have encouraged them to do. And yet when they don't find those helpful or workable, I've seen that then kind of generalized to, well, this is part of my belief system. So what are other things that I believe that might also not work or be true? And so I've seen kind of that addiction approach also have an impact on people's spiritual identity and belief. And it's interesting to see those impact each other because addiction has become part of a belief system.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's also important to not, so we see these processes, these dynamics with pornography and pornography addiction, but we also in American culture see something very broadly similar with regard to homosexuality and religion. So I think it's helpful to kind of see the like parallel cases because they illustrate some of the same processes. So with like homosexuality, to have, of course, a lot of religious opposition that was essentially this kind of moral authority, biblically based, what have you, that kind of orientation. As that became less effective in the social sphere, you kind of saw religious groups and political groups kind of draw on kind of scientific kind of research to support. But then there was this point where, in kind of the broad scientific consensus, if you will, or the science as kind of its own narrative, where there was kind of like this turning point, and where science went from being quite critical of homosexuality to, or at least academia, to broadly supportive, and that kind of the narrative fell out for religious groups that had invested in that, and then it's kind of a really trying to regather and figure that out. So one of the dangers I was pointing out with religious groups relying on pornography addiction narratives is that you can kind of get away with that to the degree that there's some diversity of perspective, in kind of research and academia. What I think is happening, though, is the tide is turning in science, in kind of methodologically reasonable science. And that I don't think in 10 years, I think there's going to be much more of a consensus in opposition to addiction model. Yeah. And then you're going to have to see religious groups scrambling for kind of new angles.
Oh, that's interesting. I haven't thought about that.
I would think like probably a better angle would be to think about broad sexual values and to think about those and kind of develop a core there. I think that'd be a more effective way for religious groups to engage with sexuality.
Yeah, now you're speaking my language, because as you talked about that moral authority, I get it. I feel a sense of like people are scared. Like they don't want to trust themselves. They're concerned about what other people are going to do. And so there's a really strong effort to kind of control us and them, others' behavior. And we do that through scripture, policy, or science, because there's a fear.
And I think that's really understandable. I think it is entirely legitimate to say there have been large-scale changes in sexuality, especially since World War II, in the last 70 years around the world, and certainly here in the United States. So I think a lot of times societies, you have this upheaval when you have significant changes around norms, sexuality, family, etc. That becomes very stressful. Societies have a reasonable interest in having some stability. Too much change and bad things start happening.
Right.
So society and religious groups have often been kind of on this stability side of wanting to kind of hold the norms. And I think there is a lot of tension around sexuality because there have been really large-scale transitions. Yeah. And again, I think that part of this is the individuality, is technology, it's the media more broadly. But I think it's very understandable that religious groups have struggled to respond. And it's part of a broader kind of interaction between religion and society and science more broadly. So these are much bigger than just sexuality, but they're certainly playing out in sexuality as well.
And I can see how with those transitions and fear, like having a label to explain behavior as an addiction versus I'm sinning or rebelling against God, or I can't control myself, it'd be really comforting to be able to have a term to say, hey, this isn't you. I mean, there's something outside of you doing this. And yet sometimes comfort isn't the same as science or helpful or accurate. But I could see the appeal in that, though.
Yeah, I think we can make a broad claim that people like straightforward, simple answers that are often not accurate. I mean, there
Absolutely.
is something kind of nice about having an easy solution to big issues, for sure. Yeah.
And it takes a lot more time to develop what are your internal values. Like, what do you want your sexuality to be? What is intrinsically meaningful for you? It's a lot simpler to say, how about other people determine that for me and have some policy?
I I think
It's a
this
lot
is
more
really
meaningful coming from
interesting, kind
within.
of at a societal level, because a lot of if you kind of think of it in stereotypical conservative liberal kind of language, for a long time, liberal forces, I'm not really happy with that language, but we'll just go with it. Liberal forces in America have kind of used the language of liberation with regard to
Mm,
sexuality and kind of
yeah,
let the individual do what the individual wants.
right.
And then, of course, we've had the language of consent, of kind of, and consent is really, I argue, is really fundamentally an economic term. This is about people going into the marketplace. It's fundamental to like capitalism and free market societies. That's where our language of consent comes from. And it then plays out into sexuality. Okay, we're going to have this open, people are going to be free to do what they want. One of the things, though, that I think is really interesting, and this definitely seen more in the last decade or so, is society, is some of these more progressive liberal kinds of voices becoming a little bit more reflexive and thinking, okay, what do ideal sexual relations look like? And I think there's some, I mean, I think a lot of people are pretty committed to the idea of consent as kind of a baseline.
Yeah.
And, you know, we can say, sure, consent is a reasonable baseline, but it may not be the totality of all sexual guidance. And so I think there's a really interesting conversation on kind of more progressive sides in America about how do we as a society think about how we do family, how we do children, reproduction, how we do autonomy, how we do expression. Um, think about like sex work and how we understand sexuality. Is it something to be commodified that we exchange on the marketplace? Is it just another thing like that, or is it special in some respects? And I really think there's the potential there for some really interesting um, conversation. So as a researcher, I'm really intrigued to see what the future holds for how different parts of society think about sexuality and think about ideal sexuality. I think those are really important conversations to have. And in a lot of ways, I really think religious groups are well positioned to thoughtfully engage those conversations.
Absolutely. Yep.
As they have it, they kind of, you know, there's kind of this the ethical or moral philosophical background, I think really prepares them well. And um, in some ways, I think kind of the attachment with regard to pornography, the attachment to the addiction narrative is kind of demonstrates a hesitancy to really wade into the deeper issues about sexuality and to be what I think could be a legitimately helpful voice in broader society. Not that everyone's going to agree, there's going to be diversity of perspectives, but
Yeah.
for encouraging society, culture at large to think about what sexuality is and how we want that to play out collectively.
And that would be a major shift, because I think back to my sex ed education. It was like, here are the STDs, these are unwanted pregnancies. It was all like the scary bad things you didn't want. And yet
Yeah,
that isn't sexual health. It was like coming from a disease model. And that was kind of my training around sexuality. It's like,
sure.
could be sinful, could be disease, sounds scary. And there's a lot more about sexual health. And so you're involved in a journal of positive sexuality. It's
Yeah.
kind of filling in the other side where we actually do need to have meaningful conversations about what are our values around our sexuality, our identity, our relationships. And there hasn't been a lot of conversation, but I think it is shifting that way to we need to broaden this conversation to the this is bad, don't do it, to, well, let's talk about sexuality and what might be healthy expressions.
Yeah, I think there's a really wide range of opportunities there for different groups, for religious groups, for other groups to engage and to really help shape broad thinking. I mean, the dynamics are continuing to evolve in American society. We've had a lot with the Me Too movement here in recent years. And so I think it's always helpful to kind of think about sexuality broadly. It's not just sexual activities and pornography, but it's about gender. It's about relationships between people. It's about families. And so there's a tremendous amount on the table, and there's obviously lots of disagreement and lots of diversity of thinking. But I think sometimes we kind of get into these us versus them political fights, which I'm not sure are really all that helpful. I think dialogue and engagement I really think it is a better mode, a more productive mode for going forward.
And that to me is exciting to think about that. I mean, if you have a religious background or more of an academic or secular background, that all those perspectives are very needed and very valuable to have all that diversity of thought, that you can have a moral stand to say, I don't think that pornography morally is a good thing. It's like, yeah, bring that to the table. Like, let's have that discussion. Or here are the merits of classifying unwanted pornography as an addiction or a compulsion or just a leisure activity. Like, yeah, let's talk about different ways that we can approach these topics. And I think that seems very different than a debate of it's got to be an addiction or it isn't. It's like, no, let's move beyond that to let's understand this in a much better.
And I think one of the things with the addiction in particular is there are always, on some level, definitional questions. So if you define addiction in just the right way, well, then maybe your activity can be addictive. But it's kind of like, use the language of addiction and you start lumping in a lot of kinds of things together. The substance abuse, the same as pornography, addiction, etc. And maybe those aren't the most helpful frames. So part of it, I think, is always coming back to the question, if you say something is an addiction, well, what does that really mean? What are you trying to get at? And I think that's kind of, those are certainly parts of what I think there's real challenges to calling pornography addiction. And some of those are just definitional. It's not really lending clarity or taking us further in trying to understand the topic. I'd also add that kind of thinking about, as being part of kind of the research world, academia, but also growing up conservative religious and being aware and kind of still having connections to those circles, I think there's something really valuable by resisting the temptation, if you will, to think religion and science and research are in opposition.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of value to bringing voices to the table and to engaging and to having dialogue. Inherently, though, I think it really means making space for people who see things differently than you, and avoiding the fight or flight response. You don't have to beat up on the people if they disagree. You don't have to be horribly mean to them, and we also don't have to run. So,
right.
But that there can really be engagement and dialogue, and I think there are those possibilities. And I hope we can see more of that going forward.
So Jeremy, I'm going to seek your counsel here because I think we need a lot more of that. And it sounds like you've been able to navigate that in your personal and professional life to keep an open mind and learn from different perspectives. How would you encourage people to do that, or how were you able to navigate that? Because you're talking about some different competing worlds that are really hard to bring in the same arena. What would be your advice for people to be able to do that?
On individual, with regard to sexuality in particular, I teach courses on sexuality here at Idaho State University and regularly have conservative religious persons in my courses, and really like to promote dialogue and interaction in kind of a course context in a classroom or something like that. One of the things that I often emphasize is to try to move the questions or the conversation to what are your values around sexuality. Not what behavior did you hear was bad or somebody told you something was bad, but what are your values and how do those play out for you, and maybe how do you wish they played out for you? I think when we think about pornography and religious persons, I think it's worth thinking through, why do people like to view pornography, broadly speaking? And there's a lot of different kinds of angles and ways of thinking about this and arguments about are humans evolutionarily designed to be monogamous, or and I mean, there's all different kinds with varying evidence and debates and so forth. But I think those are really good questions to think about. There may be a range of explanations for why people like sex, why people are intrigued by pornography, and there may be like lots of explanations. And to think about those, and then think about also kind of I think for religious persons to recognize on some level, and maybe even like I like to use the language of honor, kind of honor their sexual desires, while also recognizing that they may have other values and they may want to find ways to constrain, reinterpret. I mean, there's a lot of different ways you could talk about their sexual desires. But I tend to think that telling yourself you're bad for having sexual desires is not really all that productive. But that you may recognize you have desires, just like we may recognize we may like to steal money from the bank if we can get away with it. We may have all kinds of desires as humans that we think, oh, there's some collective good in restraining my individual desire. Like I get angry with somebody and I think I might want to kill this person, but probably not going to do it because I wouldn't want somebody to kill me, blah, 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 blah. And so I think that can be kind of a helpful way to think about sexual desire, especially in a religious context, or wanting to view porn, wanting to do whatever, is to recognize that you're probably human, and there's probably a variety of explanations or kind of interests, some of biological, physiological, sociological, whatever. The media told you to want something. I think all those could be possibilities. But then to also kind of take a step back from that and to think about, okay, here are my values. Here is the way I want to live in the context of what, I think would be helpful. And again, I think there's a lot of different ways to do that, but I think that's a really helpful conversation. So with pornography, people can say, I really am committed to and value being monogamous with my spouse, with whatever, and saying these are the kind of values because this is kind of my idealized version. And I'm not saying there are no challenges in doing those kinds of things, but I think to really move beyond the shame associated with sexual desires, I think is a good step. And allowing one to recognize desire and at the same time think about how that plays out with one's sexual values, I think is helpful.
Yeah, I love that. And that's the values piece has been a game changer for me, where people that I work with that struggling with pornography, they often come in and say, I want to change this behavior. I want to control it. You tell me what's right and wrong. And I very quickly shift that dialogue to, what is it that you value? And you've been so focused on trying to control an urge and feel terrible about being a sexual being that we've kind of neglected, what kind of relationships you want in your life, what kind of education you want to pursue, what kind of physical health lifestyle do you want to have, what kind of leisure pursuits. And I find that as we broaden that out about what do you value most out of life, we get away from this thing that is bad that we got to control to oh yeah, it can be a part of my life and it can fit nicely in other areas of my life that I also value. So I think I like that place where often people do want to debate, is this right or wrong or addiction or not? And it's how about we just set that aside and focus on the values piece? Yeah. Because that is so individualized and often underdeveloped when we've been just so focused on, I can't have this, can't have this. It's whoa, here's an opportunity potentially to sink in a little bit more and figure out who you really are and what kind of life you really want to have. And sexuality can fit in that. It doesn't have to be a scary part that needs to be eliminated.
Yeah, I think so. I think too, for persons who are part of conservative religious groups, I think on some level, people have to make peace. There's always this challenge with religion, kind of like kids grow up in religious groups, and then typically they think, okay, at some point, you've got to make choices for yourself. Do you own, and there's kind of this tension back and forth between the collective and the individual, broadly speaking, in religion. But with regard to with sexuality, and I think there's this place where individuals have to think, do they find, is there inherent value in being part of a broader group and participating in its norms, its morals, even if maybe at the individual level, I'm not totally sure about everything they're prescribing. And so I think that's, to be a religious person in the modern world requires individuals, I think it should require, it does on some level, requires individuals to kind of make peace with the fact that, do they want to kind of be part of a broader moral collective?
Yeah.
So, and some people are going to gravitate very much toward, I'm the individual, I'll make all the moral decisions for myself, I'll do blah, 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 blah. And other people might say, hey, I recognize, or I feel like there's some value in being part of a group that gives me moral direction, even if on every single issue I might not agree or understand. And I think those can be legitimate perspectives. And to kind of further contextualize that, people follow the moral values of their group all the time, whether those are religious or not. Yep. So you take a bunch of secular progressive people, and they are largely participating in broader moral kinds of narratives that are coming from other places too. Yep. So I don't think, in my mind, I think people should be willing, or hopefully can see that and say, okay, my moral framework, my values, in this case about sex, are shaped by broader communities. And I may or may not feel like that's what I want. But I think for a lot of religious persons who are committed to these kind of moral communities and that have moral implications for sexuality, I think kind of recognizing and owning that tension to say, I might have various sexual desires, but I really recognize I have chosen, I think it's ideal if you can say that, I've chosen to participate in this religious group with its moral religious framing, and I think that's valuable to me, and I'm going to then participate in those norms and those, those behavioral processes. So I think you can kind of move it that where people are recognizing that they have choices to make. I mean, religious groups don't always want people to feel like that, but I think broadly it's a good move if people can own what they believe and
yeah, I love that.
live authentically according to that.
Yeah, and I found that approach is so empowering that you can actually investigate your faith at a deeper level and your sexuality at a deeper level and make some choices. And I found that people's sexuality and their belief system can actually be much richer and more meaningful as they take the time to investigate it. And I think there's so many times that we're just afraid to do that, or we don't have the permission that you can question things, you can explore things, you can understand them. And when you do that, things change and evolve. And sometimes that doesn't have to be a bad thing. That can be a really meaningful thing.
Yeah, I think so, for sure.
I love that perspective because as you talked about it, I didn't feel like a need to soothe myself, where it's like you were allowing me more space to make choice. And I found that often people that are struggling with things like pornography feel such a sense of urgency and a powerlessness that there's nothing they can do. And yet hearing you talk about it, it's like, no, it's like you got time, like slow down, let's look at some things a little bit closer and determine your values and recognize your context, and you've got lots of choices. And for me, if people were able to feel that, like their need to soothe themselves through a compulsive behavior would go down tremendously. They wouldn't feel shame about themselves, and they would just have more permission to, you can figure this out. And I found that agency to choose is often a central part for many people's religious belief.
For sure. Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential there. I think that can be a good way to move, for sure.
Well, thank you so much, Jeremy, for sharing your wisdom and your background and research. And I didn't know you were a minister, so I get to learn something new.
Yeah, I don't always talk about it, but yeah, no, I used to. It's been a really interesting journey, religion, academia. I think it's actually given me a really great perspective on something. So
Absolutely.
I've grown to be really appreciative of my varied and diverse background.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jeremy.
Thank you. That's great.